Hi, my name is John Kelly, and I'll be talking today about gender differences in cybersickness, clarifying confusion, and identifying paths forward. This is work I've done in collaboration with colleagues at Iowa State University. So first, the clarification about whether gender relates to cybersickness. Now, before I begin that section, I want to clarify some terminology, specifically about gender and sex. So in this talk, I'll be using the term gender to refer to differences between men and women and their experience of cybersickness. Some studies have measured gender, some have measured sex, few have measured both, and I'll be using the term gender, but in fact, it may be in fact, better described as a sex difference. Furthermore, research on this topic has generally only focused on cisgender individuals, and you'll see in my future direction section that it's important for us to also consider the experiences of non-cisgender and gender diverse individuals. But unfortunately, I can't present that information here today because we simply don't have the data. Now, the literature on this topic presents a confusing picture about the relationship between gender and cybersickness. And now I want to illustrate for you some of that confusion. We conducted a systematic literature search for meta-analyses and systematic reviews, that is summary articles, on the topic of gender and cybersickness. So here a systematic review is a paper that systematically searches the literature for relevant research and summarizes it in a qualitative format. Whereas a meta-analysis generally is preceded by begins with a systematic review and is then followed by a quantitative assessment of the effect. So here we did a literature search for these types of articles, and we found 6 unique papers on this topic. And here's the confusion. One paper reported that cybersickness was greater among women than men. This was a meta-analysis of the literature. Another paper, also quantitative, reported that cybersickness is greater among men than women. Yet another meta-analysis reported no relationship between gender and cybersickness. And then 3 papers, these were all systematic reviews with just a qualitative evaluation and not a quantitative component, concluded that it's premature to draw a conclusion based on existing evidence. I want to highlight for you the first paper in this list. It is the Howard and Van Zandt paper is the only quantitative meta-analysis to analyze data that are reported separately for women and men. That is, it's the only paper to quantitatively evaluate effect sizes reported in individual papers. The next 2 papers are also quantitative, but the way they quantify the effect is by correlating the sickness experienced or reported in the study with the proportion of the sample that was female. So as opposed to the first paper, which takes data that are separately reported for men and women. And the challenge with the approach in the second and third paper is that there are a lot of variables that can impact total sickness across studies besides gender. And given that the Howard and Van Zandt paper reports a correlation of about 0.21 between gender and cybersickness, we know that means it's a relatively smaller effect, a modest effect, and it's likely to be hidden by all of the other variation between studies that gets lumped in when taking this approach of correlating the proportion of the participants that are female. So we believe this to be the truth, that there is a significant gender effect, that it is modest in size. So our tentative conclusion is that cybersickness is greater among women than men, but that the effect is modest. A researcher who then wants to go and study the gender difference would start by doing a power analysis. And if they wanted a 95% chance of detecting the effect, they would need 258 participants, evenly split between men and women, in order to find that effect. If they wanted an 80% chance of detecting the effect, they need 176 participants, again, evenly split between men and women, where 80% is a commonly used value in power analyses. So what this means is that most studies on cyber sickness are underpowered for studying the gender difference. So if we look at the contributing papers to a large meta-analysis on individual differences in cyber sickness that included 92 studies, the average sample size among those studies was around 33 participants, so way below what you would need if you really wanted to study the gender difference. Now, that doesn't mean that those data aren't useful when reported separately by men and women or broken out by gender or sex, but just that in an individual study, there aren't enough participants to make a conclusion. But across studies, we can certainly meta-analyze those data. The Howard and Van Zandt paper points to an effect size correlation of 0.21. Other good evidence comes from very large and well-powered studies in cyber sickness, and there are several of these that have sample sizes that are more than 150, 200 participants. Some of those were included in those systematic reviews and meta-analyses. I want to highlight this one because it is a newer paper and therefore reflects current technology, but also it wasn't included in those meta-analyses and systematic reviews that I just pointed to. And in this paper, with a really big sample of 837 participants, they also find that women become more cybersick than men, and that the correlation is 0.28. So consistent with that idea that there is a gender difference, but that the effect is modest. So what's next? If we can agree that cybersickness is in fact greater among men than women, then we ought to start asking, why are women more susceptible to cybersickness than men? And what factors could mitigate the gender difference? We believe that mediation analyses and moderation analyses are useful statistical tools for answering these kinds of questions. I'm going to go into some detail into mediation, just a little bit on moderation, and I'll close with some best practices and future directions. So first, mediation. Mediating variables are those that might causally connect gender and cybersickness. So the yellow box represents the gender of the person exposed to VR. The green box represents their experienced cybersickness measured in any one of a number of ways. And then the blue box shows a variety of potential mediators that could causally connect gender and cybersickness. So for example, if women are more sensitive to motion sickness than are men, and there's evidence to support that, then this could be a potential mediator, a potential causal link between the gender of the person and their experience of cybersickness. Similarly, if postural stability differs between men and women, it could causally explain the relationship between gender and cybersickness. Other possible mediators are inclination to self-report symptoms, interpupillary distance, and whether that's accommodated by the head-mounted display hardware, experience like VR experience and gaming experience. These are all potential mediators of the relationship between gender and cybersickness. I want to give some detail on a specific example looking at whether motion sickness susceptibility may mediate this relationship. So from our lab, we had some data from 178 participants, 90 women, 88 men. They were randomly assigned to play one of 3 VR games for up to 20 minutes or until they could no longer continue. And they used the Quest 1 or Quest 2 headset. They completed a lot of different measures, but 2 especially important ones for this particular analysis is that before VR exposure, they completed the Visually Induced Motion Sickness Susceptibility Questionnaire, or VIMS-SQ. This was a measure of their prior experience of sickness with visual media like movies and games. And then after VR exposure, they completed the Simulator Sickness Questionnaire, or SSQ, and that was our measure of cybersickness. So we analyzed these data using the causal mediation analysis package in R, which was based on 1,000 bootstrap samples. Before I get into the mediation data, mediation results, I want to point out that women, in fact, did experience greater cybersickness in our study than did men. The SSQ total score is their score on the cybersickness measure. There are also some subscales that I won't get into. This is the total score. And you can see women score higher. They're getting more sick compared to men. That's a significant difference. So on to the mediation. So the relationship between gender and cybersickness is, of course, significant. The beta is -20. That's because women were coded as 0, men were coded as 1. And so you end up with this negative slope. Gender also significantly associated with the history of visually induced motion sickness, the VIMS-SQ, -1.3. Women had experienced more symptoms in the past of VIMS-SQ. And then VIMS-SQ was also positively associated with cybersickness. And most importantly, the mediation analysis indicated a significant indirect effect of gender on cybersickness, a significant mediated effect. And the proportion mediated was 0.27, meaning 27% of the relationship between gender and cybersickness can be attributed to this mediation of visually induced motion sickness susceptibility. So we conclude then that history of visually induced motion sickness significantly mediates the relationship between gender and cybersickness and provides a causal linkage for to explain at least some of the relationship between gender and cybersickness. Of course, there's more to explain here, right? It's only explained 27% of the effect. So it's important for us to investigate other potential mediators. Mediators like postural instability, inclination to self-report symptoms, and so on. Next are moderators. Moderating variables are those that could potentially change the magnitude of the gender effect, magnify or minimize the difference between men and women in their experience of cybersickness. So for example, we could manipulate the locomotion method, so joystick versus room scale, or the degree of the intensity of the stimulus and how much cybersickness it evokes, or the VR content, whether it's gaming or education. These are potential moderating variables that could magnify or minimize the gender effect. Now, I don't have a detailed example of moderation analysis, but I can tell you that moderating variables are observed as interactions between variables. So you would conduct an ANOVA and look for an interaction between gender and whatever the other manipulated moderating variable is, say it's locomotion method. These moderating variables have the potential to reveal causal explanations, and they could also indicate tools to mitigate the gender effect. So finally, some best practices and future directions for research on gender differences in cybersickness. Researchers should always include demographics about gender and sex, and to be inclusive in the options that they provide. We should also be reporting data, means, and standard deviations separately, broken down by gender and sex, including, of course, non-cisgender and gender diverse individuals. And this will be, you may have not enough participants to draw conclusions from your data, but future meta-analyses can certainly make use of those data. Of course, it's important to interpret your data in the context of the sample size needed to find a gender effect. So it's okay to report data separately for men and women, even if you have a relatively small sample, as long as you provide the context for that guides the reader to not overinterpret those data. And then future directions, we think exploring mediators will provide some opportunities to find causal connections between gender and cybersickness, and moderators can identify factors that will magnify or minimize the gender effect. And thank you.